this morning? Good. Awesome. Hopefully better than me. So I'm a libertarian, which I advertise to try to get publicity out. But that also means I get to eat my dog food right now because I've always said if I lost my job to the government downsizing, I'd be happy.
Steven, you want lights down or off?
Whatever's best, doesn't matter. So, they should be good. As far as the future of Ruby, tying into Sandy Metz's talk earlier, I can't predict your futures because I'm not that cool. But I can tell you that I have done this is the second time, and each time I've had a much larger room of people interested in how Ruby relates in the enterprise than I ever thought I'd see. And that kind of gives me the idea that we may have a bunch of us working in the enterprise or thinking about going that direction. And as much as Rubyists tend to think that we're too cool for the enterprise, we are unfortunately becoming cool enough the enterprise is taking us. So my goal as part of this is to kind of help teach Rubyists how to insulate themselves from the issues they'll commonly hit in the enterprise environment. Which brings me to my story. I've been a developer for over 12 years. I've done 5 years of that using Ruby. Once I found it, I never looked back. Absolutely love Ruby. 6 years in the enterprise before I went commercial, where I learned Ruby and a ton of best practices and realized how much of a waste the first 6 years of my life were. And then went back into the enterprise for job stability after the recession and decided that instead of running away, I would take it on headstrong. And so that's what I've been doing for the past 4 years, is trying to figure out how to make life as a developer, especially a Rubyist that wants to do things the right way, easier and more enjoyable. And that is why this is important. That's my background. So what this presentation is not, it's not about the USS Enterprise. I wish it was too. It's not a magic bullet for fixing your environment. Each environment in the enterprise, if there's one thing I learned, is different restrictions, different requirements and security implementations. So you're gonna have to figure out some things on your own, but I can help you understand what I've encountered over time. And it's not a magic potion to give you a backbone or a tutorial of how to implement all those ideas. There we go. What this presentation is: a story about Agile in the rabbit hole, a recounting of common security rules, a sampling of random development issues, a recommendation of tools to help your team, and empirical evidence that you don't have to settle in spite of being in the enterprise. So how do we define enterprise? For this talk, it's going to be a very, very loose interpretation. Basically, any environment in which a developer is restricted from performing their duties how they see fit. Because that is the one common thing across every project I've been on, is I'm not allowed to do whatever I want. So let's discuss Agile and go down a little rabbit hole with me. In the enterprise, you'll get a lot of arguments against Agile quite often. These tend to be, what is this Agile you speak of? Because they've never heard of it, because we love waterfall. We already know or use Agile with a capital A. 10 other teams have already failed with Agile. Why would we let you do it? Sorry. And the main reason I discuss these is because I've literally heard every single one of these multiple times in different forms. So the big thing here is, how do we sell Agile and help them understand that it's important? This is one of those things where you have to take this fight. If you want to be successful as a Ruby team in the enterprise, you can't back away from this one. It sets a precedent for your project and your management. It establishes you as a leader who knows what they're doing with experience. Shows management that you won't compromise when it matters. Gives you a measurable metric for performance velocity averages, which management loves to eat up metrics of any kind, especially ones that relate to actually turning around code, which is why they always go off lines of code instead of something useful. And usually this is the first battle you're going to have on any project, which is why I'm discussing it first. It's one that is really difficult to sell because you're coming onto a new project in an enterprise environment with established restrictions and rules and managers that you've got to kiss butt up to, supposedly. And you have to find a way to convince them that this is the best way to help the team be successful, help the product be successful, and ultimately help the company or the environment you're in. So how do we sell it? The three biggest benefits I found for Agile in the enterprise that help convince management to use it is 1, accountability for both customers and developers, 2, measurable performance and more accurate estimates, and 3, frequent demos and releases that get everyone excited. So the big thing here is that you're able to demonstrate on a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, whatever your iteration is. I prefer weekly because it's more accountable and easier to get them involved, and it's so anti-enterprise. And when you do those demos, you're able to give them something tangible, even if you don't deploy it out yet. Just the fact that they can see what they ask for being done that quickly will usually help sell Agile. So I always start off with a challenge. I will literally walk up to any manager that's been on a project and have a talk with them, if necessary, in the middle of a scrum or planning meeting. And I will say that, as a team, we are doing Agile for the next month. If you don't like it, we can go to whatever you'd like at that point. And if they're not willing to do that, I walk away. So once you sell it, you've got to make sure it works because it's now on you. You're accountable to make sure the project is doing well with this methodology. Make sure your customers are there. Seriously, you can't do Agile without the customers to verify the things that you want to implement that they're asking for. Do not take shortcuts. Do not skip on testing. This isn't a startup. Enterprise does not generally like having things not work. They will often pay for buggy software, but they're not happy with it most of the time. And do not commit to a certain scope of stories and a time box, or you'll end up being waterfalling yourself without knowing it. They will push it every time. They will say, oh, well, can't you do this many features and guarantee it by this date? No, don't do it. Even if the contract says that you'll be done on X date and you estimated all those features to be done in that date, I'm in the government sector, we have to do these fancy fun things. You don't have to commit to that in your iteration planning meeting, and don't do it. As long as you are actually going with velocity averages and sticking to it, you will be able to get an estimate of an accurate timeline over time as to where you're going to fall. If you do it, you're going to guarantee failure of both Agile and your team and impact your credibility. And unfortunately, the first thing to go will always be testing. And as we saw before, you cannot take a shortcut and skip testing. So as we get some form of Agile implementation implemented within our team and enterprise sector, we're able to get rid of some of the constraining pieces of enterprise that tie us together and free ourselves a little bit to actually work. So security, F the world or for the win, depends upon your sysadmin. One of the worst things you can do is say, I don't need to write secure code because my app is in a secure network. Brian Helmkamp gave this quote at Ruby Nation and on his talk about security, and I could not reemphasize this enough. A lot of people in the enterprise sector tend to think, oh, well, we're on a closed environment, or we're on an app that nobody's ever going to come across on the low side, on the web and things like that. And what happens is they don't bother with basic security practices because they don't think they need them, and that will always bite you in the butt. So this ties into the principle of least privilege. Brian covered this a lot more than I will, so if you want to ask Ruby Nation, put up this talk. But the biggest thing for our perspective is bye-bye sudo. Because in a lot of enterprise environments that I've been in, you won't get it, period. You won't even get sudo commands of any kind. You'll have to submit a ticket for sudo, which is insane. But it happens. And I forgot to mention, this talk is a combination of all the worst case scenarios I've encountered over the past 4 years, not just any one specific project. So you'll get hit and miss combinations of these things. So ask ourselves at this point, why do we need sudo? Everybody tends to think, oh, we're web developers, we set up our servers really quickly. Enterprise likes to have their own servers and own and possess their things. They don't want to outsource that much. And they have sysadmins that do this job, and we're not allowed to have it. Well, why do we actually need it as developers? We need ports 22 for Secure Shell, 80 and 443 for web apps. We need to be able to have users and groups. We need to be able to have Secure Shell key-based authentication, which is enabled by default, so hopefully you don't even have to have a fight over that one. And you need to be able to have init and server scripts to restart services as needed. Very few things besides these actually require sudo. We might like them, they might be easy. It might be nice to be able to do sudo yum install, sudo apt-get update or install. But ultimately, we're lazy. We don't like to have to do things the hard way. And that's what makes us good developers. But it also is a security risk if we're not careful of that. So how do we get around it? We use the source. So something I found out about less than a year ago is GNU Stow. And I will praise GNU Stow left and right until I'm blue in the face. The reason I love it so much is that you can literally take any library you need that can be installed from source. And well, let's just walk through an example. So we'll make a directory in our home folder called opstow. We'll export stow as the stow environment variable as opstow from our home path. We'll then add opbin to our path. And then we reload our profile so we have those environment variables. We'll cd to some tarball that we've extracted. Do our .configure with a -- prefix equals stow/lib/version. We'll make install with the same prefix. Then we'll cd into the stow directory. We will stow lib-version, which is a folder sitting in that directory. And then we will resource our bash profile. And when we do which lib, it's automatically there. No sudo needed whatsoever. Any library from source, as long as you have the dependencies, which you can also install from source through stow, taken care of. This has been so nice because for 3 years before I found this, I did it all by hand and tried to figure out and manually take notes and keep notes of where I unpackaged things and where I compiled them to and what version was installed and where things lived. And if you messed up or you needed a new version, a new dependency, it kind of became a nightmare. One of the other nice things about stow is that because we're stowing with -version, you can literally go and have Python 2.7.3 that you built ahead of time. And then you can go and install Python 3.0.0 side by side in the same folder. And then if you want to get rid of 2.7.3 and make 3.0.0 the system default for your user, you literally just stow -d Python -2.7.3, stow Python -3.0.0. So what stow does is it's kind of like Homebrew, but not quite everything Homebrew does. And it'll go to the folder that's been compiled, symlink all the subfolders inside there, all the binaries, executables, libraries, things like that, and then put those in the parent directory off in your home folder. And the -d is just dsymlink, and that's it. And you can just have things left and right as long as you want and swap things out. And if you mess up, you just de-stow the one that you stowed or recreated and go back to the original in a matter of 2 lines and reload your source or profile. As far as resources, you're not going to get them in a lot of enterprises. Enterprises are cheap. They like to make money, not spend it. And if you get big enough, they're going to find you the sources you need. If your app is doing successful, they're going to help you scale when you need it. So don't really worry about it. It'll work if you need to. The last big thing in regards to security and kind of environment is that you need to be able to host multiple applications a lot of times. Due to those lack of resources, you're not getting 5-10 servers for an app on each one. You're going to have multiple apps. I mean, you're talking small scale for a lot of enterprise apps, especially initially. So you can have 5 to 10 apps on one server, no problem, without any real issues. So what we do is, you have to deal with firewalls. You either have to have things live on a different port, or you got to have a CNAME record. Unfortunately, trying to get sysadmins who understand how to open a firewall properly, or how to add a CNAME record into your DNS is not always easy. You choose which one you want to go after for your environment and fight, because you got to have one or the other. Now that we've isolated our development environment and kind of gotten rid of our dependency on sudo, we've loosened the noose that's around our neck from the overprotective security team, and we can start to breathe a little bit finally as a development team. So what are some of the development gotchas in the enterprise environment? Let's try to go top down, kind of take a BDD approach to it. So we want a website. Before we can have a website, we have to have somewhere to deploy that website. So we need servers. And all your servers do not belong to us, they belong to them. You're going to need a development server. You'll need a staging server, most likely. You'll need a production server. And ideally, you'll have a support server. The reason I throw all these up here, this is also something I fight on. A lot of times in enterprise, you'll be stuck to do development on Windows, which I'll cover more later. But honestly, that's not an easy environment to be in with Ruby. It's not efficient, and it's something worth fighting to get against. Servers are cheap. Most enterprises can afford to give you a VM without too much cost. So when you're asking for your servers, add the development server on the list of things you need, and be prepared to explain why and fight for it if you can. It'll save you a ton of pain as a developer later. Staging's ideal. You don't want to be demoing your software on production. You really don't want to be demoing it on development. If you're doing something with a source folder and you've broken the OpenSSL dependency, you don't want to demo that on the same box. Try to get staging. You can live without it. Just put it on your dev box. Don't put it on prod, please. And support is something that most people don't discuss. In an enterprise environment, a lot of times they won't fork out for awesome tools like Airbrake. They won't fork out for access to these nifty $15, $20 a month services that can do what they need and save them a bunch of heartache. Or they flat out won't allow you outside their network. So the support server is kind of a server for hosting those kinds of apps to have internal use of them. We'll cover that a bit later. So server users, for each environment that you're in, we want to follow the principle of least privilege like we discussed earlier. So we want to have a deploy user, which is non-negotiable. You have to have someone to deploy your app as. And you'd like to have a sysadmin user at a minimum, preferably an Apache, MySQL, or whatever database user as well, to kind of follow that least principle of privilege. Unfortunately, a lot of times we won't see that happen in the enterprise. You'll have to fight tooth and nail to get a user. If you have to, just get these two. You can survive with these two. You will be violating some security rules, but fairly minimal as far as the fights go. Key-based authentication has to be set up in order for deploys to be easy. It's already there by default. If it's not, push as hard as you can. I've had environments where it's not, and it's not fun, but there are ways around it with caption. The sysadmin user is going to do all of our hard work. It's going to set up Apache and Nginx, assuming that you can't, have a separate user for them. It's going to set up your DBs, set up Ruby, Passenger. Anything that you're going to be running that's a security risk should be done under the sysadmin user. And then the deploy user has only two purposes. The deploy user's purpose is to deploy the code, preferably to $home/whatever path you want with Capistrano. And it needs to make sure that Apache's user, whether it be sysadmin or Apache or HTTP, can access the folder that you deploy to. Besides that, deploy user shouldn't be doing anything. You really want to keep that as locked down as you can. What the deploy user does not do, does not have access to sudo in or log into the sysadmin account in any way, does not have access to sudo in any way, which they're taken away anyway, so that's not a problem, and does not run services or any privileged operations. And I cover this because in a lot of enterprise environments I've been in, unfortunately some of these basic server setup best practices are completely ignored or unknown about. And it's just something that we should be aware of as a developer, setting up our environment, what we can do to at least make some basic steps towards security. As far as application setup, you're going to want to install all your supporting libraries and apps via Gnusto. You'll want to do your deploys via Capistrano. You will want to vendor your gems via bundle package, especially if you're in a closed network. When you're hosting things internally, like a gem server, a lot of times enterprises don't keep their services up 24/7, and you don't want to be dependent upon a gem server being down and not being able to do a deploy because you're needing gems that can't install. Tips as far as Capistrano setups. Obviously, once again, secure shell key-based auth makes life 1,000 times easier. And if you have access, use remote cache. Much faster deploys, no risk really, and saves a lot of stuff going over the pipes. If you don't have access to remote cache, I've hit that environment, deploy via copy, where it checks it out locally, tarballs it, sends it over the pipes, unzips it on the remote end. It works, but it's slow. And use Capistrano multi-stage, which is built in now, so that's not an issue. What about your editor? So we discussed having this development box that's probably running Linux, just like our production staging server. And we're probably on Windows half the time in an enterprise environment. You might be lucky and get a Mac or a Linux box, but a lot of times you're on Windows. Many developers on Windows. I won't develop on a system that's different than my servers, or at least really close to it. At home, I use Macs. At work, I develop on Linux, because that's where I'm deployed. Get that development Linux server. It's worth it. It'll save you so many headaches. There are a lot of people in my environments who do development on Windows, and then go to deploy to Linux, and something between the binary builds will be totally different and bus production. Don't do development there, and if you do, make sure you're testing on the staging server thoroughly and have a good test suite to verify everything works. And then secure shell into PuTTY, or map via remote drive if you are missing your Sublime text. My personal opinion is, if you're in an enterprise environment, bite the bullet. You're not going to always have access to mapping your drive remotely. Learn Vim. Get your development box, learn Vim, or learn Emacs if you know you have access to it. The reason I don't recommend Emacs is, believe it or not, I've had servers in the enterprise that don't have Emacs available. I've never encountered a server that doesn't have Vim. I'm not an Emacs hater. I just go with what's always available for my environment, and so Vim is my editor. Sorry. So since our development environment is now something with sanity and can actually bring us a little bit of joy, it's evident that we're starting to get our own identity amongst an organization full of suits. So props to Thoughtbot for providing the shirt. I sent a lot of coworkers there for training. Awesome place. Getting to your code. Source control management, documentation wiki, Agile management, error monitoring, provisioning. These are all things we need, but a lot of times we don't have readily set up in an enterprise environment. Open source to the rescue. For provisioning, I personally prefer Chef. Puppet's perfectly viable. Salt Stack, several others. GitLab HQ for Git hosting is an awesome tool if you have access to it and can get it set up. For continuous integration, Kochiko just came out. Looks amazing, looks much easier to set up than Jenkins, and gives you the benefit of actually being a distributed CI if you end up needing to scale at some point. Not likely, but at least it's there. Supports Ruby, Node, Java, so definitely worth looking into. You can use Jenkins if you love it. I've been sold on Kochiko. For email and SMTP, I actually set up Mailcatcher on my support server and run it as a service, and set up a little script for it to keep it alive. A lot of enterprise environments don't have any kind of email system besides actual production email. And the last thing I want to do in my enterprise environment is email the president of the company by accident as part of my app, or whoever's high up on the list of management, and give them a test email. Obviously, never put anything stupid in your test emails, just as a heads up. People have done that. Read about it all the time. But Mailcatcher is a nice way to avoid even having that issue, where you can just set it up to run on the port on that box, open it up via the firewall, and send your emails to Mailcatcher to preview them. Urbit is the open source fork or implementation of Airbrake. Sorry, Thoughtbot, I have to mention this. And it's probably the best open source tool for catching errors. Obviously, all these things I'm recommending are self-hosted. There's a lot of tools that are open source that are pay for use, which are amazing and much better than these. And use them if you can. But for my environments, I've got to be able to host them myself. For metrics, there's Nord Metric, which is a pretty awesome project that I've discovered about 6 months ago. Haven't actually had a chance to push it out yet, but it runs in Ruby or JRuby, or maybe Java, not sure, depending on what scale you need it at. It has an HTML5 and JavaScript API for sending stats back and forth, and it's really fast and easy to set up. Golem is an awesome wiki, since we obviously have Git on our servers. And if you don't have Git, compile it from source through Gnosto. Not hard. And for security, if you can install it with permission, Snorby is an awesome way to kind of probe your apps. Continuing along, what about Ruby itself? You're going to need a gem server internally that might not be set up sometimes. Gem in a box works well unless you hit a huge scale. For Rubies themselves, I created RVM Firewall about 3 years ago, somewhere in there. Basically just a Sinatra app that you deploy internally, and it will take a tarball. On the regular internet, you'll download, run a rake task after you modify the config for what Rubies you want. It'll download them, put them in a simple structure, and then inside you deploy that tarball along with the code, and the Sinatra app sits up. There's instructions for copy and paste to set up RVM to use it, and everything runs off that server instead of the internet. For Agile project management, There's Fulcrum, Redmine, or Chili Project. I'm not a fan of any of these personally, but it's the best self-hosted open source options I've seen. If you know better, please let me know. There's nothing wrong with these. There's good plugins for Redmine. Fulcrum is a wannabe pivotal tracker. They're good tools and they're usable. They're just not as good as the commercial alternatives. For logs, there's Logstash and Kibana for a nice UI for searching across your server logs. So we've identified a bunch of these tools and we have our applications deployed. But how do we go about making sure this is easily doable all the time? So the goal is to automate all the things without sudo. So I'm working on a project right now called Setting Up and Provisioning Pragmatic Open Source Software Ruby Technologies. Support. And the ideal goal here is that you can go into the support config and you can specify what tools you want to set up, whether it's Urbit or Chef or Golem or any of these tools we just discussed, and have it download all the necessary dependencies and packages, bring it in kind of like RVM Firewall, deploy that code up to a source folder, deploy the source, run the script for support, and it'll go through without sudo using the credentials that you put into the commit file with key-based auth, and set everything up from source via GNU Sto. Hopefully it's those two users that we identified earlier. I want to give a shout out to Kenrick Chine for some of his help on this project. It's still way in the infant stages, but he's helped a lot with the testing and such as well. And so that's kind of my big project right now. I did RVM Firewall a few years ago, and I'm trying to do what I can to not have to go through the pains of setting these things up manually every time I get to a new environment. And obviously, without open source, there's no way that any of this could be possible. So huge thanks to everybody who does open source work. And with all that said, once we've got all that done, we basically have set ourselves up as a development team where we can work from home. Pants. Once you get all these things set up and working properly, it's really not any different than being a regular Ruby developer at home. Some things aren't quite as nice, but overall you can do everything you could have done on the regular startup type environment. So the moral of my story is fight the good fight, no matter what your odds. Just because you work in the enterprise does not mean you're part of the enterprise. And the reason I say that is because we as Rubyists have a high expectation of best practices, BDD, TDD, deployment processes, basic security. Things that drove me to the Ruby community and actually made me willing to get my Ruby tattoo are the things that I want to see persisted throughout the enterprise. Just because we work in that environment doesn't mean we should be able to slack off on our code, take shortcuts, and impact the reputation of Ruby itself as a community. And it's definitely going that direction, not the negative parts, but we're going towards the enterprise. And in turn, I want us to make sure we maintain the mentality and the professionalism that we as Rubyists have developed over the years. And lastly, remember that refinement, whether you start in the rough or pre-cut, the gem inside is still the same. Wouldn't be an enterprise talk without a motivational. Do we have any questions? Sure.
Yeah. So early in the talk, you were talking about convincing management that Agile is necessary, things like that. You also said that you should never agree to a set number of stories by a certain deadline. Do you have any advice on how you would present this to people?
Okay, so the question is, how do you avoid time boxing and feature commitment at the same time? That's a good question. It's different for each management team how you want to approach it, in all honesty. But for me, the best approach has always been when I'm selling them that do it for a month and see where we land, and if you don't like it, we'll do whatever you want, guaranteed. You gain control at that point. If you get them to buy into that commitment, during your iteration planning meetings, when they say, well, can't you, or even the first iteration meeting, they're going to say, well, when the month's done, can we have X, Y, Z, and D? And you're going to say, well, let's go to our meeting. We'll figure out what we think we can commit to this first iteration, get our initial velocity figured out, and we'll see where we end up after this week. And so then the second iteration, you come in and say, well, we got X done, but we didn't get Y that we committed to, so Y carries over if it's still the highest priority. And then we're going to, our velocity last week ended up being this. We're only going to commit to this. If we get more done, we'll take the next story. So you might commit to Y and Z, say it fits in your total, and you get both of those done. And then the next iteration, you have a 2-week iteration that you can average out. So you start getting that velocity average going, and you never go above that average. It will bite you in the butt every time if you ever go above that. And you just got to make that fight, no matter how hard it is, and say, this is our month of doing it the way that we're supposed to. If you don't like it, you agreed to it. Don't ever take the if you don't like it approach, but you agreed to allow us to do things the right way, our way, to see how it works. And thus far, we've actually hit X, Y, and Z in the time frame, and we will probably be able to have all 4 faster than a month, or hopefully, But the key is to kind of convince them through actual experimentation and proof that it works well, and that just because you can't commit to a certain date doesn't mean it's not going to get done. In fact, if it works well enough, you're going to get a good enough consistent velocity or slightly improving velocity that you can give a rough estimate for when the deliverable will be for the major points in the project. And that those dates will shift as the project shifts. But it's going to be a much more accurate date than just trying to shove in the stuff they want by X date. Is that what you were looking for? Any others? Sure.
I mean, I worked in a big enterprise down in Texas, and we have Windows developers and Mac developers. Highly don't recommend that combination. But we went to JRuby as a way of calming that down a little bit, the jam chaos, and we got to a point where we could almost make, pretty much have a successful move from Windows Mac workstations through Perforce, our source control, into various staging and production servers, all on a JRuby platform. Have you had any luck with that, or recommend for or against it?
So the question is, what about using JRuby as a way to kind of unify Mac versus Windows versus Linux development environments on the same team? And I can't give enough support to that idea. I've not had an environment where I actually need to use JRuby, but I'm a huge proponent of JRuby and a fan of how easy it is to set up, especially in an enterprise environment. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a good middle ground to try to kind of get a unified area since Java runs on both environments, and will guarantee your gems and dependencies should work in both Linux, Mac, and Windows. So that is a good compromise way to go about that. Thank you. Yes?
So you say that you should always try and fight the good fight, but how do you know, because you can't always fight all the fights, especially if you're in an enterprise that says you have to do this and this and this and this, and you don't have a whole lot of choices. How do you try and figure out which ones are the fights worth fighting?
So the question is, how do you choose and prioritize the right fights to fight? Because you can't win them all, which is very true. And you'll notice that I mentioned Git offhand as part of my presentation, but I didn't say anything about requiring Git to be your source control management. I love Git. I will fight for that. After I fought for Agile, after I fought for development Linux box, after I fought for firewalls or CNAMEs to be open and set up, after those 3 key things, then, and key-based auth, which I've hit before. I don't know how that ever happened, but those 4 things are the most critical things I've had over my years in the enterprise to get set up right. And those are the 4 I focus my fighting efforts on. And you have to have that backbone to really face those head on, because nobody else is going to do it for you. And it's the whole team's reputation at stake if you don't get it set up and working right. So infrastructure stuff has kind of become a passion of mine because of how critical it is, and because enterprises so often mess them up.
Can you just repeat those 4 real quick? It was
Agile, secure shell key-based auth. What did I say? The same ones I went through. Firewall or CNAME. And,
Linux.
And having a Linux dev server.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? Awesome. Thanks, everyone. We're right on time for lunch.